Thanks for clicking on the video. My name's Cameron Buckner, and I'm the host of the Dixiecryptid podcast. You can also find us wherever you get your podcast, any of the podcast apps. Appreciate you joining me. I've got 3 stories. The first 2 are great. The last story is spectacular. I don't think I've ever read a story quite like the third one, so I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. All right, here we go. Here's a Bigfoot story from Bob. Thanks, Bob. I grew up really poor. I never knew my father, and my mother was abusive. I think life turned her that way, and she took her frustration out on me. Because of the way things were, I tried to spend as much time as I could away from home. Things were clearly different in the 70s for kids like me. The bullying and the obvious signs of abuse were often overlooked or ignored by teachers and grown-ups. My school had what they called Eco Week, where they would take us up to cabins in the mountains. Well, I loved Eco Week. Not knowing my father meant that I never went on fishing trips or camping trips, and unlike other boys, I had no one to show me how to bait a hook. I never had the chance to relive the hunting stories that fathers passed down to their sons. We all piled into the school buses. The popular kids sat anywhere they wanted. Well, I scrambled to find a seat. Getting to the camp area the first time was completely overwhelming. I had never been to anything like this. We were assigned to a cabin, each with 4 bunk beds. The windows were small, which allowed light to stream into the cabin, but high enough to keep anyone from spying on you from the outside. We each chose a bed, and we laid out our sleeping bags. My bunkmate was a heavy-set boy with glasses named Eric. He was quiet, and he was shy, and he became an immediate target for the older bullies in our group. I was big for my age, and I had learned a long time ago how to put up a front, thanks to the frequent beatings from my mother. The bullies were fooled by my tough demeanor and generally left me alone. After a night of sitting around the campfire roasting s'mores, the counselors ordered us back to our rooms for the night. I helped put the supplies away and doused the fire. And in lieu of not having a healthy role model in my life, I craved the attention of the adult counselors who probably had no idea how important their encouragement was to a lonely kid like me. I was starved for affection and severely lacking when it came to my own self-esteem. I was the last one back to the cabin. The lights were off, but I heard whispers and I saw a glare of flashlights through the windows. I quietly opened the door. To my disgust, our roommates had Eric surrounded. His pajamas were around his ankles, and he was clutching the waistband of his tattered shorts. Whatever they had been planning for my poor, humiliated bunkmate, my arrival had preempted it. I hit the lights of the cabin and stared down Eric's abusers. Alerted by the commotion, several counselors intervened. They took note of the situation and promptly moved Eric's tormentors to different cabins. For the remainder of our stay, Eric and I were the sole occupants of our own cabin. We laid in our bunks one night, and Eric opened up to me about his own horrible childhood. We had both been bullied and victimized, but what had happened to him was unspeakable. And whether out of pity or empathy, we became buddies. "They'll pay for that," said Eric to me one night. "My friends will take care of them." "Who?" I muttered. "You haven't seen my friends? They look into the windows each night. They're watching over us." Well, I drifted off to sleep. Certain Eric's remarks were the revenge fantasies of a picked-on kid. Well, during the last night of our stay, something drew us all from our cabins. Our ex-roommates had been discovered sitting in the dirt near the camp restrooms. They were babbling incoherently, oblivious to the gawkers staring and pointing at them. The counselors led them away. Eric and I returned to our room and tried to get some sleep before the journey home in a few hours. We sat together on the school bus, but Eric and I hardly said a word to each other. Maybe it was a lack of sleep. We were halfway home before I noticed our former roommates weren't on the bus with us. Well, I heard later that their parents had been summoned to the camp in the middle of the night to take them home. One day, Eric took a walk out into the woods and he never came back. There were rumors he had died or that he had run away from his abusive household. I like to think that somewhere out there he simply found a nicer set of friends. Okay, that was a good story, and I read this on purpose, and Bigfoot is never mentioned in this story, so since this is a Bigfoot channel, I'm kind of assuming that Eric made friends with some Bigfoots, and they took revenge on the boys that were bullying him. Have any of y'all ever been a bully in your life? I was one time. I think I was in the 9th grade. I don't know why I did this. I've thought about this 100 times. You know, there's bullies out there that have beat the shit out of people. They never think about it again, but I bullied one kid one day, and I've never forgotten it. We were in, I think we were 9th grade, what is that, freshman high school? He was in the same grade as us, and I was a big kid. You know, I was an athlete. I played football and I wrestled and I was on the track team. I played baseball. And I'm not saying I was really popular, but I just had a lot of friends. I got along with everybody. But this kid was kind of a bookworm, kind of a nerdy, one of those kids. And I never had any problems with any of those kids. But for some reason, I got it in my head that I was going to knock his books out of his hand. So we're going down the stairs and I'm going down the stairs. He's coming up the stairs and he's got an armload of books. He's got about probably 5 books under his arm, plus his notebook, plus probably some notepads. And as he walked by me, I just shoved those books right out the back of his arm and they all scattered all over the stairs. The stairs are always crowded between classes. There's tons of people moving up and down the stairs, and he was embarrassed. And I got to the top of the stairs and I looked down at him and he was frantic, trying to get papers had come out of his books and his notebook scattered, and it was just horrible. And I thought, why in the world did I do that? So I set my books down beside the guardrail where nobody would kick them, and I went down there and I helped him pick up his books and I apologized to him. And he just looked at me like he hated me. And I don't blame him for doing that. I don't ever remember seeing that kid again. I'm sure I did. He didn't leave school over something like that. I felt horrible about it, and I've never forgotten it. Never forgotten my one time that I was a bully. And so don't be a bully. It just makes people miserable for no reason. We gain nothing out of picking on people who are not as strong as we are or not as popular as we are. So, man, aren't I a virtuous person? A virtuous moral person for not being a bully. That's not why I'm telling y'all that. It's just one of those things that just popped in my head as I was reading this story. This is the first time I've shared it with my family before. Matter of fact, I used to use that story with my boys because I would tell them, don't be a bully. If there's a kid in school that's left out, you become friends with him. If he's, you can't force your kids to be friends with somebody they don't like, but you can help make people feel included. And that's kind of what I told them to do. And they did it. And they're still that way. And anyway, it popped in my head and I said it. So there's my confession for the day. Okay, let's do one more story. This story is titled My Hairy Creature Encounter, 1987. And the man says bye, and he gives his name, but I'm just so self-conscious about reading people's names if they didn't specifically say, go ahead and use my name. So I'm not going to, but this is a good little story. So here we go. I was 19 and in the Navy when this incident occurred. Some of my friends and I from the ship liked to hang out at a bar where we were close friends with the night manager. If you gave us a free drink, we could be very useful. We would man the entrance to the place, discouraging the troublemakers and checking IDs, weeding out all the underage drinkers. After closing time, we would escort the lady employees to their vehicles. There were always a few customers who got a little wasted and tried to push themselves on the female staff. Our job was to make sure that these women got out of the bar safely, unmolested. One night, the manager asked me to take home a woman named Heaven because her car was in the shop. Isn't that a great name? Yes, that is a great name. I never thought about naming a girl Heaven, or even a boy Heaven. That's a great name. Anyway, back to the story. It was after 11 p.m., and Heaven lived 20 miles west of Jacksonville in a small town. Well, I asked my friend Terry to go with me so that I could have someone to talk to on the drive back. After Heaven got out of my vehicle and safely into her house, Terry moved up to the front passenger seat, and we headed back to Jacksonville. As soon as you get past the city limit of Heaven's small town, there's nothing but a small 2-lane highway with woods on both sides. 10 minutes into the drive with the radio on, Terry dozed off. What an entertaining travel companion, I thought to myself. Well, while Terry snoozed, I zoned out to some good tunes in my own company. A thick fog began moving in, and I flipped on my high beams, and I saw something dart across the left side of the road. Now, this thing was huge. It was about 8 feet tall, and it was the width of a kitchen table. It was covered in fur, and it looked like Chewbacca. With 2 steps, it swept across the highway and disappeared into the woods. I slammed on my brakes, and Terry nearly collided with the dash. "Dude," I yelled at him, "did you see that huge hairy creature walk across the highway just now?" "I had my eyes closed," he muttered. "I think I just saw a Bigfoot," I said. "If you want me to drive, why didn't you just say so?" was Terry's disinterested response. He didn't believe me. We went back to the bar where the manager proceeded to serve me the first of several Long Island iced teas with only a hint of the cola he uses for color. As the alcohol loosened me up, I couldn't tell if anyone else believed me either. I hadn't had a drop to drink that day, and I guess with Bigfoot encounters, your reputation precedes you, right or wrong. Terry drove me home from the bar. I know firsthand from serving in the military that there are certain things that blur the line between fact and fiction. It's what separates the believers from the skeptics. I saw what I saw. Oh man, that was the man who wrote the story, his first name is John. And John, this was a great story. I think this is the way most people encounter Bigfoot, is like driving by on a road. And I've always said that's the way I want to see one. Driving down the road, I want him to just go across the road in front of me and there be no doubt as to what it was. But this was great, and I really appreciate it. And nobody believes you. Nobody believes you. And that's quite typical. I live in a small town in North Mississippi. I'm not from here. I married a man in the Army in the mid-70s. I am from Germany, and I lived there until I was 22. This year I will turn 75 years old. My husband is gone now, and I live alone, and I do just fine. I've lived in the American South long enough that if you met me on the street and we spoke, you would have no idea that my first language is German. I was determined not to stand out, so I not only made sure to learn English quickly, but I also spoke it with the local accent. The German accent is difficult to overcome, but I did it. I have no family in Germany, and I haven't spoken the language in years to anyone other than my living children. A few years before my husband died, he and I vacationed out west. It was a great vacation, and I got to see some of the beauty of this continent. We spent 2 days at the Grand Canyon. We drove all across the southern rim, stopping at every place of importance or the places that had a view. The people travel from all over the world to see the canyon, and while we were there, I heard many different languages spoken between family members. When I finally heard a couple speaking German, I immediately approached them and explained that I had not spoken the language in years. Did they mind if I talked to them a while? I think they were as excited as I was. They had been in the United States for 3 weeks. They didn't speak English and had had a difficult time communicating during their stay. Well, we were staying in Flagstaff for the night, and so were they. They wanted us to join them for a meal that night, and I accepted before I asked my husband. I knew he wouldn't mind. We spent hours that evening talking about everything from my home country. They were from a town close to where I grew up. It was a joy speaking to them and even helping them, even for only a short time, translate the menus and interpret for them to the waitress who took our orders. The conversation was lively, and I had no time to repeat in English everything they had said in German to my husband. I know he felt left out, but he never complained. I think he saw that it gave me a great sense of pleasure to speak my native language again, and it was a fun night that I will never forget. In our life together, we had 3 children, and I taught each of them the German language. I saw no reason to deprive them of that part of their heritage. Once the first 2 knew the language, teaching it to my youngest son was a breeze. His brothers would fill in the gaps, and there were many nights around the table that German was the only language spoken. I have no doubt that my husband had listened long enough that he knew the language well enough to understand much of what was said, but he always said he didn't. He was that way. But when I would scream at him in anger or frustration, he sure understood it then, and I still laugh to myself about those times. Tragically, we lost one of our sons in an accident, and it crushed both of us, and we spent a year grieving along with his brothers. But it has been many years, and while we never forget, and the pain of that loss never leaves us, we learn to adjust and cope with it. And I've done that for years now. One thing that helped me was to visit my son's grave on a regular basis. Now, my son is not there. I knew this when I began my visits. My son is asleep, now waiting to be raised again by our Creator. We are Christians, and we believe this, or we know this to be our hope. But even with the knowledge of our future and the state of my son's body and soul, as well now with my husband since his passing, going there is comforting to me. I still drive and go there once each week, still at the age of 75. And I talk to those men and I tell them about my week, and I speak to them like they are there. And even though I know they do not hear me, and no, I'm not crazy, they don't speak back to me, it still gives me comfort and hope. My husband and my sons were and are hunters. Deer season around our house was a festive time of year. There's nothing a mother of 3 enjoys more than watching the excitement that came every opening weekend and even throughout the season. My husband's family has land in the Holly Springs National Forest. It's been passed down for generations, and remarkably, not 1 acre has ever been sold. And that is where the boys hunt, and boy, have they taken some big deer from that area. My husband and son are buried there with generations before them, some who fought in the Civil War. So when I make the 30-minute drive there once each week, it is a serene and beautiful place to be, especially in the spring, and to talk to the 2 men that I've lost. My husband talked about a creature that roamed the woods of their property. He called them boogers. For many years, I didn't know what he was referring to. I didn't really care. There were occasions I thought he was joking, maybe to even get a smile from me. Once the boys were old enough to hunt, he insisted that I have apples on hand so that they could take them into the woods on their hunts. They would drop a few apples at the base of the tree from which they hunted for the boogers to pick up later. He never made a big deal of these creatures, but he would talk about them like you and I would discuss the behavior of a dog, any common animal. He once explained to me what they were. He didn't want to, but I had pestered him for some reason, almost the entire deer season, to tell me what they were. I needed to get an image in my mind so that my imagination wasn't creating a creature that was nice when it wasn't, or one that was sinister when it wasn't. Finally, one evening at the dinner table, an evening that we were only speaking English, he and the boys, who were teenagers at the time, explained what the creatures were. Later that week, we watched a movie on VHS called The Legend of Boggy Creek. Creature in that movie was not nice, or it didn't seem to be nice, although it never harmed anyone. The boys explained that the boogers lived in the forest and had probably been there for many years, maybe even hundreds of years. They had all seen one and spoke about the creature with great authority, much like they would talk about anything else they knew well. It was important to them to leave an offering with each hunt. They always field dressed their kill on the spot, left the internals, or they left apples. They would simply drop them from their tree stands when they arrived so they wouldn't forget. We bought the local grocery store out of apples during deer season, and that is how I learned about the boogers. After my son's death, while at the cemetery, I began seeing shapes move through the trees while I was there. I wasn't sure what it was, and I was never alarmed. They would come in and out of view, never fully revealing themselves. I never put it together until one day I mentioned the strange events to one of my sons while he and I met for lunch one day. "Well, those are boogers, Mom," he said. "They knew Jacob, and they see you visiting him. They know you're his mother. I don't know how they know, but they know. Otherwise, they'd scare you away." Well, I remember sitting in silence after he told me this. I wasn't sure what to make of it. I had never fully believed in these boogers. I suppose since I had never experienced them, they were a joke in my mind, because I wondered for years whether my husband and the boys were laughing at me all the way to the woods with their backpacks full of apples. You do know apples are a favorite food for deer, right? Well, I finally verbalized this to my son. He smiled at me and he laid his hand over mine. "Mom, they're real. Now, you've seen them. You just said it. You just didn't know what you were seeing. Now, the same thing happened to all of us. But I'm sure thankful that Dad was there to explain them to us," he said. "Well, should I be afraid?" I asked. "I don't think so," he said. "If they wanted you afraid, you would know it. You should keep visiting and don't change anything. They will someday let you see them fully. If it takes 10 years, then it takes 10 years, but they will show themselves. They've done that for all of us." 1 year ago this week, I began bringing a bag of apples with me on my weekly visits. I leave half on my son's grave and half on my husband's grave. They are a few plots apart. The next week, the apples are gone. Now, it could be deer coming into the cemetery and eating them, or other wildlife, but I don't think so. Last week, after many years of visiting the cemetery and hundreds of words to those men who never hear me, 2 of the creatures showed themselves to me. The temperature was in the 70s, which is nice in January, and I had been there an hour, sitting at the cheap little picnic tables the boys had placed there for me, when I saw the same movement I had seen so many times before, and 1 and then 2 walked into full view at the edge of the woods that encompassed the area. They never gestured, nor did they make any sounds. They didn't really look my way more than a few times. They just stood there in full view, almost shy in a way, shifting their weight from one foot to the other, like a child might on his first day of school. They were enormous animals, and I should have been terrified, but I wasn't, thanks to my son's explanation. I sat there and I watched them until they walked back out the way they had come, and it was over. As I walked to my car, I whispered to my boys in that cemetery, "Your boogers came to see me today." Well, I hope they heard me. Now at age 75, I feel like a child again. This spring, when the weather turns warm, I want to begin to bring my grandchildren with me to the cemetery, and I'll tell them about the creatures that live in the surrounding forest. They are teenagers and one or two are in college, but I will invite them to go with me when they are in town. I don't know if they'll go with me, but they should. I'm hoping their fathers will encourage it. They need to see this and hear the stories.